Hello. Hello, Karen.
Oh, hello. Hi. Is it just you and me? Is this right? Are we on the right link? Is this the Terri White call?
Hello, Margaret. You're muted.
No, I was trying to find the controls, Alan, so that I could unmute myself, no matter how many times I use Zoom. Always get it.
Oh dear. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm a bit zoomed out, but apart from that, I'm looking forward to not having to actually perform.
No, I know. I think we're all a bit zoomed out, are we not? That will.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Zoom has brought us lots of opportunities to do some really good stuff. I think we would all agree, but it's also exhausting. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got 30 Chinese students who vary in quality from almost no English to ones who've spent 10 years in the States. So it's an age-old problem of how do you actually balance teaching to such a wide range of experiences. And I'm not sure I've got it right, but you can only try, can't you?
you can only try, yeah.
Yeah. Trying, that's the word.
That's absolutely it. So how difficult is it working with the time difference?
Well, it's 8 hours at the moment. So I do, early-ish for me, and then it's evening for them. But we've got the clocks change at the end of the month.
Okay.
They don't change in China. Also, the other interesting thing about China, it's across 5 time zones, but they have the same time. So wherever you are in the country, it's always the same time, which makes it a little bit easier from their perspective. But it's one of the many things that the Chinese students don't understand is the changing time zones, because they don't do it. So, yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I'll clear off now. Have a lovely time.
I'll see you soon, Alan. Hopefully see you in person before long, maybe this year, maybe this year.
Yeah, okay. Have fun. Looking forward to it.
Alan.
Just say hi, Margaret.
Hello. Hi, Alison. How are you?
I'm really pleased to be here. It's quite a treat for you, isn't it?
Yeah, it's nice to see you.
Yeah.
It's lovely to see everybody. We've got quite a lot of people who have signed up for today's event. So
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I hope it goes really well. I'll disappear. I just wanted to say hello.
I'm sure it will.
Hi, Terry. It's Kate here. Saw you doing the thing that I would do as soon as I go online with my hair, thinking, when can I get it cut?
Oh, God, I know. Me and my hairdresser are counting down the days.
Hi, Terry. It's Margaret Hughes. I just want to say hello and welcome. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much for coming along. And hopefully we're going to be joined by some of your pals, the lovely Laura Dunlop.
Oh,
and
goddess.
Yeah, and hopefully Peter. I don't know if Peter Houston's coming along right enough. He might feel crowded out by the women. Who knows?
Oh, he'll love that.
I know he will love that.
He enjoys
Amanda Geary, it's lovely to see you too.
I have missed the sound of your voice.
Oh, that's so lovely that you say that. Most people don't miss the sound of my voice, so I'm absolutely delighted that you've said that. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to have you back in the journalism education community too. I've been here only for an hour, so it's great to see you.
I think Jane's here. Oh, there's Jane.
Is Jane here?
There's quite a few people joining at the moment, so I can't see people joining. Hello.
Hi there, you all right?
Yes,
hello,
thanks.
Jane.
Thanks for
Hi,
joining
Jane.
us.
I'm Margaret Hughes. It's nice to meet you.
Hello, Margaret. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Right.
So we have quite a lot of people signed up today, so I'm going to give people a few minutes. I know that lots of people are doing this in their lunch break, so I think we'll just give people until 1 o'clock until they get the chance to get themselves out of maybe other meetings and things like that. But it's so lovely to welcome everyone today on what is a very cloudy day in Glasgow, but hopefully it's sunnier elsewhere. So for those who attend AJE events regularly, usually Amanda quite kindly said that she had missed the sound of my voice, and everyone who attends AJE events, particularly since we've gone online, have heard my voice quite a lot. So I'm really delighted that today, really proceedings are going to be looked after by my fabulous colleague, Kate Williams. So Kate's actually I'm only going to say hello and welcome and thank you. And then Kate is going to take over. We are estimating that we should be finished just after 2 o'clock, I think, depending on, I suppose, how many questions that we have. And how long Terri and Jane are available to ask questions. Obviously, we understand that people may be doing this in their lunch break. They may be doing this while they're doing something else. I think we've probably all done that. We've gone on to a Zoom and we've been multitasking. So we understand perfectly if people do need to leave. We will also be recording the event today because we also know that lots of our colleagues are teaching, some of them are working, and I know that certainly some of my own students have asked if they can see the recording of this. So we're going to be recording this so that we can share with colleagues who won't be here and with our own students and with anyone really who wants to look at it, because we will host it on the AJE website. We will also be sharing it with our colleagues internationally as part of the World Journalism Education Council. So we actually do have a wee bit of an international audience this afternoon. We know that we have colleagues calling in from other countries, so we're absolutely delighted to welcome everyone who's joining us. So it's just to let people know, if they don't want to be seen on screen, that, you know, the usual, you can just blank your screen. The other thing we would ask is, and I will put this in the chat, but I noticed that Deborah Wilson-David, one of the AJE committee members, has also just said if we can remember to mute our mics. Now, obviously that's something that I can do here, but it's quite good if people can do that themselves. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start with welcomes, and people can join us as they go along. So for those who don't know me, my name is Margaret Hughes, and I am, well, we dispute what my title is sometimes, but I'm chair or maybe president, depending on which day it is, of the Association for Journalism Education. And for those who don't know what that is, it is an organisation which seeks to promote, to represent journalism education, teaching, research. We really exist to support our members who are primarily people who teach journalism at around about 90% of the universities in the United Kingdom. So that's who we are. We have held regular seminars and conferences. Really, we hold conferences in real life a couple of times every year. But since we've gone into the pandemic, we've held lots of online events and welcomed people from around the world. We're really delighted to be holding this event today. I took over as the first woman chair of the Association for Journalism Education 4.5 years ago, and it is one of the absolute privileges of my working life to be in this role. And I am very conscious of the fact that, you know, as a woman, there are often greater expectations laid on our shoulders, but also just that responsibility that I have to do well and also to promote the work of women in our field. And that's something that I take very seriously, and I know that the committee takes very seriously. So we really do seek to ensure that our panels, as far as we can achieve it, are balanced in terms of women and men. And also for me, it's a great privilege to work with such a fantastic group of women. There are lots of brilliant women in journalism education. And I've really, since I took over as chair, an event like this is something I've really wanted to do. And it's one of the gifts that the pandemic's given us, that an event like this we can do online quite straightforwardly, whereas we probably couldn't all have made times in our diaries to have attended an event like this. So thank you everyone who's come along today. I want to thank in particular our two speakers, Terri White and Jane Garvey. I was reflecting this morning as I went for a walk about that sense of, although I don't know these two women, I feel as if they're part of the tapestry of my life, because I love Women's Hour. I've listened to it since I was 21, which is, as we all know, probably only about a decade ago, but it is very much, it's been very informative in my life and in what I think about things. And also Terry's magazine, Empire. I love film, I love magazines, and I love the fact actually there's a really brilliant woman editing and in charge of one of the best magazines around. So it's a real privilege. I feel as if I know these women and I don't. So it's a real privilege today to be able to meet them, to say hello to them and hear what they've got to say. I want to welcome journalism students who are joining us today. We know that the future of our industry is really challenged. I think that the future of the industry can only be made better by having lots of brilliant young women journalists in it. So welcome to all of the young women joining us today, and welcome to everyone who's joining us. I want to say a particular thank you to the women on the AJE committee, because their support to me in my role has been invaluable. And I also want to thank the men on the committee because they are equally as supportive. So I'm now going to stop speaking. We will, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we will get to questions at the end. And I'm going to hand over to Kate Williams, who's going to look after things from now on. Kate, thank you.
Thanks, Margaret, and welcome to everyone. We had loads signing up for this, and it's good to see so many. I can't actually see Jane on the front page. Jane, are you still there? She might have dropped off.
Sorry,
I'm
on my phone rather than my laptop.
There you are.
I apologise. Something went wrong,
okay.
but I'm back.
Okay, that's okay then. So as Margaret said, two guests. Jane Garvey, former presenter of Women's Hour, and we'll get on to what you're doing now, and obviously a presenter of the Fortunately podcast. I think it's fair to say you became the flag bearer for promoting the cause of equal pay for women at the BBC, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps because you felt as a spokesperson, you presenter on Women's Hour, that was a role you could play. And Terri White, editor-in-chief of Empire magazine, you were the first in your family to go to university. We had a brief chat last night, and it was interesting hearing you chatting about working in a pretty male-dominated area of the magazine industry in the early years as a journalist, so plenty to talk about. We actually asked, or tagged it as, what challenges have you faced as women in the journalism industry as you started out on your careers and in your careers generally. We are doing it for International Women's Day. We are a few days early, but that's because we thought there's loads of fantastic events happening on Monday, so we get in there early and secure two great guests. So Jane, if I start with you, did you feel beholden to become a flag bearer for equal pay, or was it just that you felt so passionately about it, as we all did?
Did I feel beholden? I thought it would look pretty dreadful if I didn't do something, bearing in mind that Women's Hour had been one of those programmes that had kept on talking about equal pay, even when it wasn't very fashionable. In fact, if you went back in the programme's archive, I think it first talked about equal pay in 1948. So by the time it came around to a lack of equal pay at the BBC, the home of Women's Hour, of course, it did feel pretty ridiculous. So I think if we hadn't played a part in banging the drum, it wouldn't have felt right. It wouldn't have sat right with me. So I mean, I did it. I have to say, I actually thought we'd just get a petition up and then it would be sorted out in a couple of weeks. So I was quite naive. We did get the petition up and that got a certain amount of publicity, but like all things, there are waves of interest and enthusiasm. Obviously the last year everyone's been focused on something else, but actually we did make strides, and if all we did was got people talking about it, then I would say that actually it was worth it.
And what reaction did you get personally from colleagues?
Mixed, I think, from colleagues, everything from indifference to support, and actually some hostility. Not even every woman thought it was a good idea to make a song and dance about it. And I think a lot of people were producers at the BBC were probably quite quite angry about the amount that presenters were making. I think, don't forget that this all started because there was a big reveal of presenters' salaries. Of course, most people at the BBC are not presenters of any kind. So, and I think there was a certain amount, actually, I think I can call it naivety from some of the people at the BBC. They just didn't know how much more than the average presenter was paid. So although I might not have been earning much relative to other presenters, I was certainly earning a lot more than my colleagues. And, you know, I won't lie, it caused quite a few bits of tension, let's put it that way.
Mm. So, of course, you went to Woman's Hour via 5 Live, and you were there at the start of 5 Live, presenting alongside Peter Allen. And in the early days of 5 Live, it was known as Radio Bloke. It was an image that they really wanted to change. And did you feel very much that you've been brought in as a sidekick, and how was that?
Well, I was brought in as a sidekick. I mean, I think we had the very traditional male-female dynamic. I was 29, he was 48. I think that we were meant to, whether we knew we were doing it or not, I guess we probably did flirt with each other after a fashion. I mean, you fall into that trap in a way, I guess. And we were very much of that sort of broadcast, that school of broadcasting. I should say I like Peter very much. You know, he's a really good friend of mine. I genuinely like the guy. So it wasn't difficult working with him, although we didn't always get on. And he was very much the senior partner. He did the big interviews, and I was supposed to sort of chuckle at his jokes and read the news headlines. And it kind of evolved, and I became much more of an equal, we were an equal partnership. But I don't think we ever earned the same. And I worked with him for 13 years, and I suspect that for the vast majority of that 13 years, he will have earned considerably more than me. And I find talking about money is it still feels quite tawdry and quite awkward. And like Terri, by the way, I'm so glad to be able to, I love Terri's book. I think she's great. So really glad that I can be involved in something with her. But I'm the first in my family to go to university. And I think my parents, for example, who are still alive, were very embarrassed by me making a fuss about my pay, because as far as they were concerned, I was earning the sort of money that it was cloud cuckoo land, you know. So they found the whole thing deeply, deeply awkward. And I think when you start from that mindset of, aren't I lucky to be here? And you're often told as a woman, aren't you, what a great job, aren't you lucky? And of course you kind of go with it, because it was a great job and I did feel lucky. But that didn't mean that I shouldn't earn as much as other people doing the same job as me. So I'd just say to people, you've got to be a bit wary of that, I think.
Yeah. Terri, did you feel very lucky to be there when you left university and got your first job in magazines?
Oh God, unbelievably. And I do just have to say, Jane, the feeling is so mutual. I've been so excited. I've been saying to people, me and actual Jane Garvey together on the same bill.
I've got your book here.
Oh,
I've got it with me.
But yeah, lucky was the thing. And especially the class has always been a real thing for me in terms of being a young working class woman, especially going into men's media. I worked in men's magazines for 10 years. I now edit a film magazine, which has traditionally had male editors. Most entertainment or genre magazines by men.
Come and say hello.
Yes, so lucky was the thing. You
say hello.
Sorry, hold on. It's Carolyn. You've got your mic on. You're interrupting Terri. There we go, Terri.
No. Yeah, and you are often told you're lucky, but it's funny on pay specifically. I remember was it my third job, something like that? I found out what a man doing a similar job to me earned, another section editor, and I was paid considerably less. And I took that number to the editor at the time and demanded the same pay. And he said, oh, it's experience, it's this, that, and the other. But I did eventually get that extra pay, but it was only because that man had chosen to share it with me. There was a rule where you weren't supposed to talk about your salaries, and we all know the reason you're not meant to talk about your salaries is so you don't realise you're being underpaid. And similarly to Jane, I felt so, you know, somebody like me who comes from a working class background, nobody in my family had even worked in an office before, or been in school post 16, the thought that I would be demanding money felt incredibly crass and slightly ungrateful, but I also had a very strong sense that I deserved it and that I contributed the exact same amount as that man, and I deserved to be paid equal. But I had to kind of swallow all those a bit of shame actually as well, that I would have the audacity to ask for money. That I'm so glad I did.
So you started as a PA and editorial assistant. How was it in, I mean, the magazines you were on, they were male magazines, and how was it, and how did you manage to make the break across?
Yeah, I mean, magazines in those days, this was 21 years ago, had very junior jobs, which were PA jobs, secretaries essentially to the editors, and it was really a way in. But I can tell you that even on the men's magazines, all those jobs were done by female journalists. So they weren't secretaries, as in trained secretaries. We were all people just trying to get in. The men all went in as junior writers. So there was a clear kind of way in that I felt I could use. And then it was about, I had a brilliant editor who became my mentor, who's a very close friend now. And I just said to him, I want to be a writer and I want to be an editor of a magazine before I'm 30, which was this thing I had in my head. And so I worked, and what I did feel like I had to do was I had to work longer and harder than the men to prove that I was of equal value. So I was always the first in the office, the last in the office, took on loads of extra stuff for no more money. That wasn't my job. And I felt like my way to stand out in this sea of mainly middle-class men was to show that I was a grafter. And then once I'd proven my graft, I could try and impress them with any talent I might have. And so I just moved up relatively quickly, but I did kind of, it was work at the expense of everything else, really. I didn't have much of a personal life. I didn't have much of a social life. I was very focused, and I regret that in some way, because I think by doing that, I basically affirmed that that was an okay way for women to have to get through, that they couldn't just be taken at face value and like the men I was working with. So even though it succeeded, I think I just bought into the system really and made them think that that was an acceptable way for women to progress.
Jane, did you have a mentor? You've turned your camera off rather than your mic on. Oh, I think she's gone again. So, oh, there you are. Yeah, did you have a mentor? Or was it kind of a male or a woman who helped you on your way?
I had a really good local radio station news editor and then manager when I was, because I was in BBC local radio for 7 years in my 20s. And I've actually got kind of, I didn't get to Radio 4 until I was 42 or something before I set foot in Radio 4, 43 actually. Might even, anyway, older than that maybe. So I certainly, my rise to the middle was not meteoric. I mean, I did 7 years in local radio, which is quite a long time. And actually I could easily have stayed there in some ways. And then my boss in local radio was really good because he put me on the breakfast show and let me be a presenter of a breakfast show, which I think was quite unusual. And certainly for a while, quite a long time, I was the only woman doing the local radio breakfast show, because those breakfast shows were never given to women. I mean, it was a real rarity. The women traditionally did the afternoon show and talked about the WI, and nothing wrong with the WI, but you know, that was where they put the women. And so to put me as, I think I was 25 and they put me on the breakfast show, or he did, a man called John Pickles, and he was actually brilliant and sort of oddly inspirational, let me get away with so much. I mean, I remember on one occasion I just had really bad period pains, and at the end of the program I just said, oh, you know, thanks for listening, and this program was brought to you by Feminax. And not particularly funny line, but it was there was a complaint made about it, because this was in the 1990s where you know, women didn't have periods. I mean, they certainly didn't talk about them. You know, the idea that things have changed so much for the better in the last 10 years, particularly in that area actually. And my manager protected me from the complaints, you know, just said, oh, so what, you know, she's 26, she probably has, yeah, leave her to it. And that's a very benign example, but it was that sort of thing that he was really good at. And so funnily enough, actually, in the early stages of my career, I had nothing but encouragement from male bosses, possibly because I didn't have any female bosses. That might have been why. But I think the generation of female broadcasters above me were not brilliant at reaching down to help other people. And it's something I don't think they can. I think my generation has been slightly better. We're much better at trying to help, I think.
There's a bit of a theme here with you presenting at 26, and Terri, you were an editor of Shortlist at 29.
Mm.
So how did people treat you when you were walking into meetings as a 29-year-old woman?
Yeah, I don't think anybody expected a 29-year-old clearly working class woman. I always felt like I looked working class, which I don't even know anymore what that means, but I always felt like people could tell. And I would go into ad agencies, I would go into big client meetings. People usually presume I was there to take notes. I was asked more than one time. I would set up a meeting, somebody would come in, and there'd be an assumption that I was there to take the minutes. I've been asked before to take the minutes, even when the most senior woman in the room. And it is a challenge because, you know, our industry, a lot of it is based on respect. And I always felt like I had to kind of push harder to earn the same level of respect that probably a lot of my peers got naturally. And I think there's a danger it becomes a bit of a performance. So, you know, I kind of felt like I had to act like an editor and was very conscious of what I said and my tone of voice. And I think I probably for a while could be quite hard, which isn't my natural personality, but I felt, you know, it's kind of like the Sacher effect, and I felt like I had to sound and act quite tough and quite hard at times, and be quite tough and quite hard to my staff, so that I got the same level of respect. And it's only as I've got older, I'm now 41, I've been doing this since I was 21, it's only as I've got older that actually you realise that isn't actually necessary, because I have been doing this a long time, and I think I'm really good at my job, and I really love my job, and I'm incredibly experienced. And it's only when you have all that under your belt that you realise that is the thing that does the talking for you. And so I do regret those times as a younger woman, because I think standing there, the message I was giving to other women who were junior was, this is what it takes to succeed. You have to become this harder version of yourself. And and that's another thing I regret, and I wish I could go back in time and kind of tell myself off, because I think it's really important how you behave and how you put yourself across, and the messages you're giving when you're visible, even if you're just visible to the women on your team. I think you have to be really, really mindful of what you're telling them about their own prospects, and how they should be able to kind of get on, really. Would you do anything differently though? Yeah, I think I'd just be a bit more myself. I'm a very kind of warm-hearted, quite emotional person. I'm incredibly loyal. I really try and look after my team and look after my staff, and I wish I think we're trained to see that softness as weakness, and when I worked with mostly men, it was very much any emotion was seen as weakness. And I think all that kind of empathy, especially in magazines, being a journalist, that empathy, that is what allows me to connect with our readers so deeply, to know the stories that they want to be told. That comes from my empathy, and so I wish I'd not seen it as a weakness. And I think things have changed a lot since, you know, it was late 90s, just on the cusp of the noughties when I started out in magazines. So I think things have changed a lot. But I think the role of empathy, especially in our jobs, is a real strength, and I wish I'd seen it as such. Jane, does any of that resonate with you?
I think I became a presenter quite shortly after going into the BBC. So I suppose when you leave the normal sort of the group of producers and become someone slightly on your own as a presenter, because it is a really odd and actually quite an isolated thing to do for a living. You're in a room largely on your own, talking to groups of people you can't see. And you are naturally somewhat distant from the people who are helping you to do that thing. And we all know, certainly Kate and I know, that some presenters are utterly monstrous. But I would also say that they are allowed to be, that there is, that in a funny way, their eccentricities, idiosyncrasies, or in some cases just plain bad behaviour, it's facilitated by their colleagues to a degree. It's quite odd, that dynamic. There are any number of hideous examples of people who are just awful. I mean, and oddly enough, they're often the ones whose public persona is that very sort of saccharine, sweet thing, and they're actually far from it in real life. So I'm sure I have been in the past, well, I know I have, certainly at Woman's Hour, I was irascible, pain in the arse, grumpy, complaining. And it was probably because I found myself doing it too much that I decided to leave. I think I really did. I have enough self-awareness to know when, I've been saying the same things for too long. So the best thing to do is push off, basically. But it is hard to know, because I think part of the Meghan Markle issue is that we all know that a woman of colour in particular is much more likely to be called a bully, and it's not unconnected to the fact that women generally get a bad reputation a lot faster than a man. So there are some female broadcasters who are thought of as hard-nosed and difficult, but actually all they are just behaving a little bit like some of the men in broadcasting. There's a shocking double standard still. I really think there is. Or
they're speaking out, or just putting their viewpoint forward.
Yes, he's a man with he's just got strong opinions. And it comes down to the way women interview. Emma Barnett, who's now doing Woman's Hour, is often she's a really she's straight. She's absolutely on it. She's a really quick, incisive, and yes, I mean sometimes maybe you could argue she's too on it and too incisive, but she gets the sort of criticism for those interviews that a man wouldn't, and didn't and hasn't, and I just think that is simply, and to be fair, I think women are just as capable of criticising other women as men are. Women are often worse, actually, which is a difficult area, but nevertheless true from my experience.
So we just heard from Terri saying she probably had to be harsher than that's not the Terri that she is. What did you do when people were treating you as the sidekick rather than the equal? Did you speak out?
No, I just seethed privately, because and by the way, I was doing breakfast initially at 5 Live and then Drive, and by the time Peter and I were doing Drive together, it was much more even. But in the early days of 5 Live, which started in 1994, the whole network was brand new. I'd never lived in London before. I was very young. I'd come from a rural local radio station in Herefordshire and Worcestershire. I hadn't done any big stories. There weren't any big stories. And yet I was now in a studio in Broadcasting House, living in a flat in Islington, being driven to work. So I, going back to what I said earlier, I did feel lucky. And I certainly wasn't in a position to throw my weight around and say, look, can't I interview the Secretary of State for Defence? Because I did that really big story last year about Hereford crested bin bags, can I please? And it wasn't going to work. So I kept my head down, but I was inwardly livid. I remember that. Yeah, a lot.
Yeah. Terri, did you have a kind of pinch me moment like Jane did when she went from rural to London? Presumably when you went to America, was it?
Yeah, I mean, I moved to America when I was 32 to do a job there, and that was kind of the moment you dream of, really, because I think anybody who's ever wanted to work in magazines is very aware of kind of, especially the New York magazine picture, what that looks like, the glamour, the skyscapes. When my cab went over the bridge and went into Manhattan, and I got my one suitcase that I turned up with in the back of the cab, that was kind of the moment when I was like, wow, this is what I've been working towards. This is the pinnacle of my career. It actually wasn't as it turned out. That's what my book is about. It's about a breakdown essentially I had in New York. But it was a kind of the dream, I suppose, that I bought into. And it's incredibly cinematic and incredibly exciting, and it really does feel like you've walked onto a film set without anyone noticing. But actually, the real pinch me moment is just that I get to do this every day for a living. You know, when I've been editing Empire now for 5.5 years, and there are days, not recently, but days when I would be sat in a cinema in the middle of the day watching an incredible film for work, that's my job, and then going and interviewing the filmmaker about this incredible film they've just made. And those are the moments where I'm like, I cannot believe this is my actual job. It's obviously been very difficult during the pandemic, but the thought that I get to kind of do that and write for a living and edit, you know, I'm a very hands-on editor. Page craft is really important to me. I love the process of building magazines. It's getting to do that day in, day out was all I'd ever really wanted to do, and the fact that I can is I still have that sense of feeling incredibly lucky, which I try not to allow to kind of dominate the narrative, because I've worked incredibly hard for the last 2 decades, but it does still feel like a privilege, I have to say. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, so it's because my phone was ringing. And as you say, America was hard for you, but, you know,
yeah,
it's documented in your book.
Yeah, there's a big difference in the media industry in America. You know, magazines in America are big money. British magazines are, but, you know, New York is an entirely different story. And kind of all the worst things I suppose you hear about American working culture is absolutely true. The competitiveness. You know, somebody said to me on my first day in my job, who'd wanted my job and I'd got it, said, don't worry about me stabbing you in the back, I'm going to stab you in the front, which was meant to be something to put my mind at rest, which didn't necessarily work. But and you know, and actually what Jane said really rang true, in that some of the competitiveness from the other women I found very difficult. And I think there's so many reasons for that. We're socialized to see each other as competition from birth, basically, for men, for jobs, for everything. And I think I felt the consequences of that in that office, where the men were much more were probably a lot friendlier to me, and the women saw me, because of the job I'd got, as competition. And some of those unhealthy dynamics were incredibly toxic in New York. It was, you know, people kind of not turning up for meetings I'd put in. I'd ask them a question in meetings, refuse to answer me, just stay silent even when I called their name, pretend they couldn't understand what I was saying because of my accent, like lots of, and it was, you know, incredibly difficult. I write in the book of going into the toilet at one point and just sitting on the floor and crying my eyes out, because it wasn't the collegiate kind of, in Britain, magazine teams are like little gangs. Most people are pals, but if not, you kind of all respect each other. The very hard-nosed business environment in America just made things incredibly difficult. And it wasn't a culture that I particularly enjoyed, because I'm in magazines, as I said, for the creativity, for the craft, speak to the audience. You know, I think magazines are some of the greatest things we make, and all of that kind of came second to this very aggressive business sense that just didn't sit easily with me. So I stayed in New York in total for about 3.5 years, but then came home to edit Empire.
Has it tempered how you work with women?
Well, I think it's I don't know if it's tempered how I work with them. As I say, I try and set a better example these days. I think example is everything. So I think we learn from the women who lead us. So there was definitely a period in New York I was being given loads of targets, was very obsessed with metrics and numbers and hitting targets. And that kind of led my editorial vision. I've tempered that side of it when I've come home. So, you know, Empire, the way we choose stories, the way we tell those stories, there's a lot more creativity. As I said, I'm much more kind of connected to my empathy these days. There are women on my team, and I'm very keen on setting a good example. And by that, I mean not working weekends every single weekend, not working late hours every single night. I never used to have any kind of split between my home life and my work life. I just worked constantly. I do now have a 1-year-old son, but even before I gave birth, I very, very, very deliberately set boundaries. And because if I'm there working till midnight every night, working every weekend, basically saying that again, oh, you have to do this to be able to succeed, then I just think that's a terrible example to be setting to those other women. And so I put boundaries in for myself, but by doing so, I feel like I'm putting boundaries in for them. And I want all the women who work on our team to feel that, you know, there isn't this competitiveness. I want to be there to support them, to guide them, to mentor them, to help them grow as designers, photo editors, writers. That's kind of an important part, because I think women mentoring other women is, you know, is absolutely what we should all be doing, and it's the way to kind of pass on good practices, but also instilling them from a young professional age that there are different ways for things to be done, and it isn't always about working longer and harder and these kind of old-fashioned ideas of how women can succeed.
Yeah. Jane, did you find it very different going from a news and sports station to Woman's Hour, and the people you were working with, and the way of working?
Yeah, there's a very big difference. I mean, really, it's going from 5 Live to Radio 4 is it's a weird one, because Radio 4 is a very strange place to work in lots of ways. 5 Live was always fun. Obviously, it's news and sports, so there's always something happening. You never quite knew what was coming next. Radio 4 is much more, the pace is so much slower, and the listeners are older, naturally. Obviously they're trying to do something about that at Radio 4 now, and I think Woman's Hour, the new Woman's Hour, is kind of more energized, which is good. But yeah, it was as though I'd never worked in radio at all, actually. It was, I may as well, it didn't seem to count for anything all the years I'd been at 5 Live. Radio 4 tried to make me sound more like Radio 4 and didn't really succeed, I don't think. Well, I hope they haven't anyway.
And you've left Radio 4, as in left presenting Woman's Hour, but you now have your Fortunately podcast. How did that kind of come about?
Well, it was the idea of a producer who has left the BBC, actually, but who just had the idea that podcasts were too male dominated, which I think they are. And well, they certainly were, and rather depressingly, the BBC hadn't done a lot about changing that. I mean, they put a lot of work into trying to get young people, and particularly young men, to listen to podcasts, hence Peter Crouch and all that sort of thing, but there'd been no real attempt to do anything for women, middle-aged women. So this guy had and it was a man, had the idea of just getting me and Fee Glover, who's another Radio 4 presenter and a friend of mine, in a studio and just getting us to talk. And so we just talked to each other, and he played it to the then controller of Radio 4 and said, well, why can't these two do a podcast? And the controller at Radio 4 at the time, who was also a woman, said no. And then she just didn't like it. She didn't like it. She didn't think anybody would be interested in it. Couldn't see the point of it. And I suppose it goes back, some of women are not always the greatest. They don't always get it. But, anyway, but somebody else was more persistent. Someone else took the idea on, and in the end, they were persuaded that we should do it. And it is, fortunately is a very odd thing, and it's not always a brilliant podcast. Sometimes we have good weeks, sometimes we have bad weeks, or we have okay weeks. Sometimes we have a guest who's really brilliant. Other times you can tell we're not that invested, and nor are they. It's grown into something that actually, I think, particularly in lockdown, has really meant quite a lot to people. It's become a community, which is the thing that podcasts can do in a way that sometimes radio can do, but it's in a different sort of way. So I'm really proud of it, actually. I'm now just doing it at home in my spare room, recording it remotely, and take a certain amount of pride in being able to do that, having to upskill myself at my advanced age. So that's been good fun. And Fee and I are writing a book together now, and we were doing a sort of tour, a podcast tour, which I think there's going to be an event. Well, there is an event at the Royal Festival Hall in July. So, it's it's just weird. It's just taken on a life of its own. I can't really explain why. Woman's Hour was such a kind of straitjacket of broadcasting. You know, it was very sort of buttoned up, and it was quite in the early years when I did it. It was very scripted and tremendously staid. And to be fair to me, I did change that slightly. By the time I left, it was a lot more freewheeling. But it definitely needed to change, and now it's had one. So I think that's good, actually.
How did you feel when the podcast stopped just being a podcast and they said, actually, we want to put it on Radio 4 as well?
Well, that was really part of it's very complicated, this, but because I wanted to leave Woman's Hour, which, by the way, no one ever wants to leave a Radio 4 programme. They just couldn't believe it. It was just like, what were you doing? You had a job there. Because of course, Jenny Murray, who was also doing the programme up until very recently, was 70 when she stopped doing it. So there was, of course, no way they could get me to leave before I was 70. So I basically had quite a nice, I could have seen out my last couple of broadcasting years quite nicely on that programme. But so they didn't really know what to do with me. And I'm still not entirely sure they know what to do with me. So they just bunged the podcast on the radio, which basically, frankly, gave them an excuse to pay me a certain amount of money. It's all but we're back to money. But money does matter. I'm afraid there's no getting around that. We all need to be paid. So I'm doing a new interview show for Radio 4 in a couple of weeks, but that's, we've done a bit of that already. So that's kind of happening. But I'm at a different, I'm trying to work on a whole range of other things at the moment, which is interesting and challenging.
Why did you leave then? I mean, you mentioned about becoming grumpy and irascible, and perhaps it was time to go.
But... Okay, I heard myself complaining just too often. And every time someone came up with an idea, I'd say, yeah, I've done that. Yeah, I've done that. Oh, I've interviewed her. Yeah, I've interviewed her 3 times. Okay, all right, I'll do it again. And, the audience and the listeners and the programme deserve better than that, frankly. They deserve enthusiasm. And it, the programme has just had a massive rocket up its fundament. And it's good. And of course, some people are cross about it and they want the old style programme back. But, that's not going to happen. And nor should it. It's I actually think that Woman's Hour these days is probably the most energised programme on Radio 4 by some margin. And it's making the rest of the network sound, quite pedestrian. They're using tech in a good way, in an interesting way. And, I think it's good. But that some of that change could have happened with me there, actually. So there are some days when I think, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not there at the moment. But then, you can't. I've done it for 13 years. I have interviewed every with the exception of Terri, actually, who I didn't interview. I have interviewed every famous actress, writer, politician. I've done a lot. And I'd run out of original ways to do it. I really had. So, give someone else a try.
Yeah. And Terri, you were on Woman's Hour. It was just Jenny that interviewed you, wasn't it?
Yeah, Jenny did a lovely interview, yeah.
I mean, what struck me about both of you when you first came on is that you were both really pleased and excited about being on together.
Well, can I say to anyone who hasn't read Terri's book, I mean, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, Terri. You must be so chuffed with it.
Thank you. Yeah, it wasn't the easiest thing to write, I have to say, and I have a full-time job as well, so I have these weird days where I do my actual job and then I go and lock myself in the spare room, kind of write about the worst things that had ever happened to me for about 4 hours and then go to bed, and that was it kind of for about 6 months. But yeah, everybody's been really lovely about it, actually. So
it is an amazing book, and it's now been optioned as well, hasn't it?
It has. It's been optioned by Bad Wolf, who obviously did His Dark Materials, Discovery of Witches. So that's really exciting. Yeah.
How do you think you'll feel when you see it on screen?
Oh, well, it's funny because I do a podcast as part of my job, which is called the Pilot TV Podcast, and we review shows every week. And I keep having this thing in my head where we have to review it on that podcast, and how weird and awkward that would be. Actually, when it got optioned, they were putting out a press release. And I thought, who's going to care that my book's been optioned? And then it was run by like Variety and Deadline and all these big kind of Hollywood websites, and I got a call from the editor of our website bollocking me for not having given Empire the exclusive, and I was like, but why would anybody care? But that was a bit of a flash of my worlds together, I have to say.
It must be a bit weird as well, having all this going on while you're still being an editor and also a new mum as well.
Yeah, last year was quite intense actually, because the book was due out 1st of April. It was April initially, then I got pregnant, so they put it back to July. And my son was born in February, 3.5 weeks before the first lockdown. I took 6 months off, so I was back at work in August. So yeah, it was quite an intense year, I have to say.
Okay, and don't forget, everyone, you can start putting your questions in the chat because we haven't got that much longer. So if anyone's got any questions for them. How have you found juggling motherhood and being an editor-in-chief of a magazine, which obviously I can tell you still absolutely love doing it. It must be very demanding.
It is, I have to say, and we have a quite a specific setup. When my boyfriend, who is an art director on films and TV shows, he is doing full-time childcare. So the initial deal was I did the first 6 months and then he did the second 6 months. Obviously with the pandemic, we both did the first 6 months, but he is full-time childcare. So I go upstairs every day and work in the nursery. But it's difficult because, you know, trying to have meetings and do editing when my child is screaming 2 rooms away is really, really difficult, I have to say, and it's quite punishing, and the hours are long. So it's probably, if I'm being honest, more difficult than I expected it to be. I was kind of really determined that I was going to go back full time, 5 days. But there's a reality around, you know, his bedtime and things like that. It's definitely been trickier than I thought. But who knows what it'll look like when the world gets more back to normal and I'm in an office again. But yeah, it's difficult. And I spoke to somebody the other day who's got 3 kids under 5 and was working, and I was like, I am barely clinging on with one at once. So yeah, I think lots of us are in the same position, to be honest.
Yeah. So we've got a few questions coming in. Trinity says, what would your advice be for young females looking to break into journalism? Who wants to go first?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm sure Terri would agree that for all the ups and downs in anybody's career, I've just enjoyed working, and what a privilege it is to be able to say that you've enjoyed your job. You know, actually, you forget that at your peril. To be able to wake up in the morning and think, oh, good, I'm going to work, is not a feeling shared by large numbers of people in our population. So I heartily recommend it. I think the problem is you've got to be prepared for knockbacks when you start. For God's sake, don't take that personally. Absolutely everyone gets those. So go for it, believe in yourself, and just in the nicest possible way. I'm afraid you've got to put yourself about. You've got to ring people, you've got to email people, you've got to put yourself in people's faces, and eventually you'll get a break somewhere, and then when you're there, you'll prove how brilliant you are.
Did you do a postgrad? Sorry.
No.
I've got no journalistic qualification at all.
Me either. I did English literature at university and then needed to get a job straight away. And Jane's right on all of that. And I would say don't. And the knockback thing is really important, because there'll probably be a moment where you'll go one of 2 ways, and that decision early on is really important. So when my first PA job, that magazine closed down 9 months after I started. And so I was like, okay, I've done 9 months secretarial work. I'm going to go and get a writer job on a magazine or another editorial job. And I remember the big boss basically wangled it so I could get another PA job to, I think, to the paper director or something. But it was good money and it was a stable job. But I knew if I took that other secretary job, I would just keep going from well-paid PA job to well-paid PA job. So I said no, even though I was skint, I had no backup, I had no money from my parents, I wasn't even in contact with my parents, I had no safety net. I said no and kept holding out for that next job, which ended up being the features assistant at Woman and Home magazine. And I'm so glad I did. And that I still look back on that moment as kind of the fork in the road. And I had to kind of hold my nerve a little bit, even though, you know, when you don't have a financial safety net, it's really hard to make those decisions. But I'm glad that I stuck to it, because everything came down to, is this going to get me closer to my ultimate aim of editing a magazine? And so it was really important for me to have the goal, and then every decision was made in service of that. And I will say, if you can get a mentor or get somebody to agree a structured mentorship, that would be really, really beneficial, because also that person can introduce you to other people in the industry, will let you know of opportunities that might not even get advertised. But it is, you know, this job is, I think I have the best job in the world. I really, really, really do. And anybody who wants to get into magazines, don't listen to everyone saying magazines are dead and they're all buggered and they're not going to exist. Lies. It's still a brilliant industry.
So would you have done anything different when you started out? Kath James is saying, what one thing do you wish you had known when you first started? What would you tell your younger self?
That no decision is irreversible. I remember, you know, I was always so, even at a young age, I was so worried about making the wrong decision, because I was convinced that that decision was going to wreck the entirety of my career. I put a lot of pressure on myself. And, you know, I went to New York, it didn't work out, I came back. Actually, it's only as you get older that you realise, you know, no decision is forever and is permanent. If you go off and take the wrong job and you don't like it, you go and get another job. And I do wish I'd enjoyed it more, because my 20s, when I was very singular in my ambition and my drive, and I was all about getting this editor job, and I worked stupid hours and I didn't have much of a social life. You know, I should have been out having a great time in the best city in the world. And instead of enjoying the job, I put a load of pressure on myself. It was quite intense. But I worked on a magazine in my 20s and earned half decent money, and, you know, it should have been enjoyable. So I do remember my first boss saying to me, you know, just enjoy these jobs, because it's a brilliant time and they're brilliant jobs. And I wish I had enjoyed it a little bit more.
What about you, Jane? Anything you wish you'd known when you first started? And what would you tell your younger self?
Yeah, Terry's totally right about, I was also petrified. I think if you've come from a place where you don't take success for granted, and I did have I should say very supportive parents who really helped me when I first started out, in the sense that they kept on paying my car loan after I got the sack from a job in advertising, and that car loan that they paid for allowed me to get my job in local radio, working for a commercial local radio station who were paying me 60 quid a week. And without mum and dad's help, I couldn't, you know, I could never have driven down there to even attend the interview, you know. So that's hugely significant, and you know, I'm very grateful to them for that. But yeah, so I'd set off and did my graduate career in advertising, and lasted 6 months, and just got the sack in the most humiliating circumstances imaginable. And I'll always remember mum and dad came to collect me, which is very sweet, and take all my stuff back in 2 cars. And we stopped at Hilton Park Services, and I'll remember this. My dad said to me, "So what are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, the thing is, Dad, I really, really just want to be a DJ." And he just looked at me and said, "You're on your own there, love. Right, let's get home." And we just walked back to the car in silence, and that was that. I think also, I suppose, you know, all that business, may God grant me the confidence of an average man. I mean, you know, I'm afraid that is true. It would be amazing to have. There are some really average people around in broadcasting, and an awful lot of them happen not to be female, and they just don't seem to have the self-doubt. And you know, I would love to swap places with them just for a day, just to see what that's like. Must be incredible.
Yeah, probably don't even notice. Terry,
No.
Lily's asking, is film journalism in the UK still dominated by men?
Yeah.
The editor of Total Film is female, she says, but I notice most of
Yeah.
their writers are male. Is this reflective of the film journalism industry, or is it changing?
Yeah, so both, so Empire and Total Film both edited by women, which is incredibly rare. But I think that film journalism still has a massive diversity and representation problem. So it is still quite heavily male. There are a lot of great female writers kind of coming through, many of whom are freelance and are kind of building their own brand. Hannah Flint, for example, is one of those. She does radio, she writes for Empire. And staff, I mean, our staff is probably 2/3 male. But, you know, it's because traditionally film criticism has been very much the preserve of the white middle class man. It really is. And we've tried to take steps to correct that. You know, I brought in probably 10 to 15 female writers into Empire who didn't already write for the magazine. There is also a problem, I think, in most journalists predominantly being white. I think this is not a problem that's specific to film journalism. I think there is an issue in journalism generally, and a lot of it's because of the you know, the way people come in, the gatekeepers, who gets to get those jobs, how do people get experience. You know, an industry that still is often based on work experience, which people do for free, who can afford to do work for free. People who've got financial support from middle class parents usually, or live in London. So there are some systemic problems, I think. I think actually what's been interesting about the last year is it's made us realise that actually, you know, this London-centric view of everybody has to live in London and everybody has to move down here from the north of England, I think that's going to look totally different over the next few years. We're definitely not going to go back to a full-time in the office in Camden scenario. And I think actually that is going to be one of the biggest changes, which then those kind of socio-economic problems which are inbuilt into magazines, a lot of that can start to be dismantled. So it's definitely better than it was, say, 5 years ago, but I still think we've got a ways to go, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. Hannah Scott's asking, what are your opinions on the mainstream media's coverage of women, in particular Meghan Markle in the newspapers? Jane, you mentioned that briefly earlier.
Yeah, well, actually, the last phone-in I did on Woman's Hour before COVID was in the last February, when the big story was about Meghan and Harry wanting to leave the royal family and go and live in America. And it felt at the time like it was a really, really important story, but that was just in the dying weeks of normal life before COVID really struck. And it was very interesting. The callers to that phone-in were more varied than we normally get on Radio 4, because Radio 4 is an extremely white network, and it knows it is, and it knows it has to change. And of course, not surprisingly, therefore, the bulk of the audience are also white. But we got some very interesting callers that day, and many of whom women of colour who did feel that Meghan has been completely unfairly targeted. And I'm pretty sure they were spot on. I think she has been. I think the whole misogynoir thing is something that Woman's Hour has certainly talked about. But of course, Woman's Hour hasn't had a black presenter. It's had so Anita Rani is now presenting on Fridays, and Ritula Shah has presented Woman's Hour in the past. But you know, there are it's very similar to the situation Terri was describing. Broadcasting, certainly at network level, has a hell of a long way to go. And on Woman's Hour, we were joined 5 years ago by a young woman of colour as a producer, and the change that her presence brought about to the programme and to the way we thought as a programme was really significant. But I'm actually quite embarrassed by how we were, in truth, because you know, what do I know about what it's like? I don't know what it's like to be a black woman growing up in Britain or London or anywhere else. No idea. And I think, I think there were some massive issues there, which we've sort of begun to tackle, but a hell of a long way to go.
What about the mainstream media's generally portrayal of women writing up stories?
Well, I mean, you know, the Daily Mail, for example, it's so difficult, this, because Jenny Murray is now a columnist for the Daily Mail. Now, you know, what do you do with your principals when the Daily Mail offers you a column and a considerable amount of money? So, and you could write for The Guardian, some people do. You don't reach as many people, you don't get as much money. So I'm afraid there's so many grey areas. It's actually really difficult. I mean, I think, and by the way, I should say that we know the Daily Mail traditionally has a reputation for being pretty vile to women and about women, but it's overwhelmingly read by women. So, you know, we're back to where we started, really. It's a tricky one, that, isn't it, really?
Yeah, what do you think, Terri?
Well, I mean, just on Meghan Markle, I think it's an absolute disgrace. I think there is, you know, it's, to my mind, it is racist and sexist and classist, and it's entirely unacceptable. From the outside, it looks absolutely deranged. When you look at the sheer scale of the story and the blanket coverage, and as soon as, you know, you put the comparison between her and Kate, the headlines about the way she dared to hold her own pregnant belly, about her eating avocados and that avocado, I mean, it's so absurd and so offensive, and it feels at the moment, I have to say, like we've lost our collective minds. My friends in America can't believe what the press in this country, parts of the press in this country, are doing currently. I think, generally speaking, I think it's tricky, and we're not all without blame. I worked in men's magazines for 10 years. I wrote an article for the Observer, sorry, on the fact that as a working class woman, I advanced my own career really by being part of, you could say, exploiting other young working class women, the women who appeared in the pages of those men's magazines. There's a debate about whether those women were being exploited or whether it was something that they wanted for themselves and their own individual ambition. And I think, you know, I look back on those days working in men's mags, and I feel incredibly guilty about some of the stuff that was published and working in those magazines, and how did those magazines socialise young women, but also young men, to perceive those women like. And so it's a really tricky one, and those magazines would absolutely not be published today. Quite rightly, I think it's changed. The culture has changed entirely. But I think the point about the male and the female readership is really, really interesting. But and all that, as we say, is can be part of how women are socialised to view each other negatively or as competition. But I think there's more accountability these days, and I think we're able to challenge those things a little bit more. But I mean, there's a lot of the Meghan stuff, I think, just shows that kind of toxicity still that is present.
Yeah, which brings us on to probably what's going to be our final question is to both from Emma Wilkinson. Have you got any tips for negotiating what you want, whether that's better pay, different role, flexible working?
I mean, I would just think be direct and know your stuff. So I used to, kind of, as we alluded to, hate talking about money, hate asking for things. There's a definite bit of class stuff in there where I didn't think I deserved it. And like Jane says, the confidence of a nice middle class boy in a magazine office, please give me that one day. But if you don't feel it, act like you do. So whenever I've negotiated something, I just keep it I know all my facts. I know exactly what I'm asking for. I know comparative numbers if I need them. If I'm negotiating a bonus, what underpins that bonus? What do I need to do? I just keep it very to the point, very direct, but also know what your bottom line is, know at which point you're prepared to walk away, and don't be afraid of walking away. It's taken me years, but I really know my worth now, and I don't feel grateful, I don't feel lucky. That is my worth, and that's what I've worked hard for, and it's what I deserve. And as soon as you know what those bottom lines are, know exactly what you're asking for, I've always found it a really straightforward negotiation, and you can usually pretty much get what you want if it's a reasonable ask. I think most people, like I as an editor, people often don't negotiate or they don't ask for things, and in that position I always feel it's incumbent on me to make sure that person is being paid fairly, so not to offer them low and expect them to come and negotiate high, because you're not passive in it as the manager. You have oversight and visibility on everything. So if you know one job is being underpaid, or a person is going to be made an offer that's too low, then it's your job, I feel, to correct that without them having to fight for it.
What about you, Jane?
Well, I mean, it's slightly different because, first of all, I don't think I am anywhere near as good as Terri sounds at negotiating. Secondly, for a large part of the time, I was sort of, the BBC pay structures are slightly more formalised than, but then again, they're not, are they? Because presenters were paid on a whole different pay scale. And actually, as I now know, I was savagely underpaid as a broadcaster for most of my BBC career. I mean, I don't think there's no getting away from that. And I think I could have pursued a pay claim along the lines of Samira Ahmed and there are probably loads of us, actually, female presenters who worked alongside men whilst earning a lot less than the men we were working with. But I'm afraid I've supported Samira. I went to her tribunal. I didn't have her courage, and you have to set aside huge amounts of time to put yourself through that ordeal. It's very public, potentially humiliating, and not everyone wants to go there, and I absolutely get it.
Jane Dodge is asking, has anything changed at the BBC since Samira's case?
Oh no, it definitely has. I mean, for a start, I think they think very long and hard if they were to have a female-male presenting duo and they have them on different salaries. I just don't think that would happen anymore. They wouldn't dare. And I think the conversation has moved right out into the open. Things are much more transparent. First of all, those salaries have got to be published every year, and it's a bit of a wince moment for the BBC when they come out full stop. But they would never dare have a situation as they had back in 2017, when the overwhelming number of people on that high-paid list were white men. I mean, it was awful. The optics of that were truly dire. So they won't let that happen again. So no, things have changed without question. It was worth it. It really was.
Well, we've ended on a positive note. Thank you both very much for your time. There's been loads of questions. Thank you everyone for putting the questions in the chat. I don't know whether you two want to have a scroll through before you leave, because there's some interesting comments being made. But Jane, Garvey and Terri White, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just thank Terri and Jane again, and can also thank Kate for managing that really well. Thank you so much, Kate. And can also thank everyone who's attended. And I would just echo what Kate said. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. There were so many of them. We have recorded the event. We will share it on our website. So please feel free to share, to watch, and to keep in touch with what we're doing. And have a great afternoon, have a great weekend, and have a great International Women's Day. I think we've heard lots of really positive things today. We know that there are still challenges ahead, but I think that there's lots of opportunities as well. So let's move forward positively. And the tagline for International Women's Day is choose to challenge. And I think the very fact that so many women are now in leading roles in lots of organisations is a real indicator that lots of us have chosen to challenge the norms. So good luck to us. Well done to us, and let's keep moving forward. Thanks very much, everybody.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yes, Terri, go for it.
Because there was some chat about increasing opportunities for women of colour specifically. I think Amy and a couple of the others were talking about it. I think it's on people like me, other editors, people in management positions, to actually go and find talent. I think this thing of, you've got to break your way through, I think that's a very old school way of thinking. So for example, at Empire, we've identified people who are either really at the start or writing we loved, who we're trying to bring into Empire, and then it's up to us to kind of mentor them, break them into Empire style, make sure they kind of develop with us and that we help them on that journey. We used to have a thing where you had to have a certain amount of experience before you could be published in Empire. That in and of itself was gatekeeping. So now what we're doing is trying to work with people, mentor them at a much earlier stage and take that opportunity to them rather than expecting people to come to us. And I think that has to be a switch in the entire industry, where the outreach is happening from publications themselves, from newspapers, whatever it may be, and taking those opportunities into that community, really, on Twitter, on Instagram, wherever it is. And we've published writing in the last few months by people who we've gone and sought out and worked very closely with. So that's just something I wanted to address, because I know people were talking about it.
Yeah, and that's really encouraging. So thank you so much for that. There were also some of the, I think probably maybe students and young women journalists making some comments in the chat around mentoring. And we know that there are mentoring schemes out there. So there's certainly the International Magazine Centre, which Nikki Simpson runs. So Nikki, I think, has put a link to that in the chat. So look that up. And also the Women in Journalism organisation, which the AJE is going to be doing an event with in the next few months, runs a mentoring scheme, as does the John Schofield Trust. So there are opportunities out there, so people should be able to go and look them up. So yeah, no, thank you, really good point. Thank you. Terri?
Yeah, or just email somebody directly. I'm mentoring somebody who just emailed me and asked, and I thought she shows great promise, and we've just published her in Empire, her first piece. So never be afraid to get a knockback, because somebody may say no, but also somebody may say yeah.
And I think that's the thing. It's about just having the confidence to do that, isn't it? And often as women, we don't have the confidence to tap on that door, because you start from the place of thinking, well, nobody's going to listen anyway. And I think particularly lots of the young women that we teach, you know, somebody made a comment in the chat about being the first generation at university, and sometimes, you know, they don't have the confidence just to go and ask. And I think hopefully what we would be trying to encourage them to do is to do that, because, you know, it does pay off. I was having a conversation with some of the young women that I teach the other day, and I was saying, you just need a piece of swagger. You just need some swagger. And it's just something I feel as if I wish somebody had told me that when I was 21, because it takes a long time to develop that. So I feel as if that's going to be my mantra from now on for the young women I teach, and the young women in my life, you know, my nieces, you know, just have a bit of chutzpah and just go out for it, because that's what we all need to do. And for the most part, other women will support you. My career, the most supportive people have often been women. Equally, there've also been women that I've worked with that have been an absolute nightmare. You know, so I'm not looking at things through rose-tinted glasses. I don't think any is do that. But by and large, I think most of our experience has been that women have been supportive, and that we are here to support each other. And certainly that the AJE is here to support women in any way that we can do that. So thank you. Deirdre O'Neill, you can always get to say something in the AJE. You have to unmute yourself.
Hello. Fascinating discussion. And Terri, I just thought it was really interesting what you said about modelling that behaviour. I think that's, I had a female boss once who modelled fantastic behaviour, and that's what stuck in my mind. It's not somebody even sitting me down and, you know, say, but the situation is I also did have a lot of problems with women bosses. I've had mainly women bosses, and I think it's because I'm fairly opinionated and don't always say, and they really can't cope. And I think we do need to recognise this, and as you've pointed out, a much wider culture here, and that we've got to start addressing as women. And also so many of the things, I'm going to be frank here, that you talked about, because I'm semi-retired or retired now, so many things you both talked about is so true of academia. You know, we've all experienced it. And Jane talked about the average people with lots of confidence. My God, academia is just full of those, and they're mostly of a certain background, and they're mostly male. But there we go.
Thank you, Deirdre. Does anybody else want to pitch in while we've got a few minutes left to talk? Nikki?
Yeah, I put it in the comments, but I just wanted to say that mentoring is good for any person at any stage of your life. I think we spend a lot of time talking about how, you know, we should help people up the ladder when they're younger, and of course that absolutely is true. But I think as well that we often get to a certain point in our lives where we're kind of expected to know it all, and it's sometimes really difficult to ask for help in that situation. I speak to a lot of publishers who are who see themselves as being so advanced in their career, and they know everything and they know what they're meant to do, but they can't quite push over that boundary. And we tend to turn to people like coaches and so on in that instance. But I think that actually mentoring can be so useful there, just to feel heard, just to kind of have somebody to bounce ideas off of that isn't your own colleague, just to kind of speak to somebody with a completely different life experience to you, you know. So yeah, thank you, Terri. Thank you, Jane, for such a brilliant talk. Really good. Thank you.
Thanks. Good question, Nikki. We love Nikki Simpson. She's been a huge supporter of AJE and University of the West of Scotland students. So thank you, Nikki. I'm going to actually, there was a question in the chat, and I'm going to just totally indulge the privilege of the chair here. Esther Tarnay, who's one of my brilliant students, well, one of my brilliant graduates, as is Hannah Scott, and they're both sitting there really quietly, and they're not quiet at all, Terri. Esther had a question. Esther, you had a question that I thought was interesting. Do you want to shout it out and see if, I think we might have lost, you know, Jane is still here, but it was a good question.
Yes, hi.
Hi
So
there.
I was just wondering, as a woman who knows the struggles of a professional life in a mostly male-led industry, I was wondering if you have any tips on how to kind of cover and interview women in a different way, to kind of, if there's something we can do sort of from the inside to challenge that way that women are portrayed in the media, because it's sort of what I'm hoping to do one day.
I think it's really important. All the details really important. So when I joined Empire, I put in new policies around photography of women. So that the women needed to be as clothed as the men, because sometimes actresses are shot in underwear, bizarrely, in very revealing evening dresses, and a lot of that photography was used in Empire. And I thought the visual language, what that signified, wasn't right. We're a magazine about film, about filmmaking, about the craft of filmmaking. That doesn't need the actress to be in her underwear. So we put in a brand new picture policy. I put in some policies around language. So I didn't want to see any women described as sassy, any gendered language that I felt was reductive about women and their talent. Was all kind of banned. I didn't allow any questions around personal life, around, you know, their kids and stuff. They basically, it was all about putting them on exactly the same level as men, so there was parity. We would never ever ask a man about his kids. We interview men all the time, nobody asks them about their kids. When a female actor is interviewed, or a director, she will absolutely be asked about her kids. And so it's, for me, it's not even necessarily the overt sexism, because that's very easy to call out and to change. For me, it's about changing the granular culture as well, because that is, if we ask a woman about her kids, show her in very few clothes, what that signifies to our readers about women generally, never mind just the woman they're reading about, I think is really important. So for me, the way I shifted it was to really look at the detail, look at how we present women, write about women, the wider context in which women are set. And I think those things can be quite meaningful. And I think as women, it's just, you know, telling stories, you know the story that you're interested in, you know the story that other women are interested in. And I think not just serving a male audience, a lot of places, you know, Empire does have more male readers than female readers, but it's kind of chicken and eggs. If you write for men, you get men, and if you get men, you write for men, and round you go. So I think it's about not always just serving a male audience, thinking about the differences in what a female audience may want, but that it's both big scale, but it's also in the detail, like I discussed.
Mm-hmm. Good, that's really good. I think it's really, I was also really struck by the point that you made, and I think Jane made it as well, and it was a brilliant phrase that a brilliant woman who I'm really privileged to be good pals with, who's on the call today, Mary Irwin, says to me some years ago, the internalised patriarchy, and I had never thought it like that, how women just internalise the patriarchy and act it out. And I think we see that, and that chimes with some of the comments that Deirdre was making as well. That sense of, you know, you have to play out certain roles because there are just certain stereotypical things. And I think as women in any sort of, certainly any leadership position, we need to model our behaviour differently. We need to actively not behave like that. because that teaches other, particularly younger women, that there is a different way to do things. And I think that's what we need as we move forward. I'm going to give one last opportunity to anybody, because I'm really conscious of the time. Would anybody like to pitch in with one last question for Jane and Terri?
I've got some dry cleaning to pick up. I've got such a hectic schedule today.
No, nobody.
That's time to finish it then, isn't it?
Time to finish it then on that note that there's dry cleaning to be picked up. Absolutely. Can I just say thank you again so much to Jane and to Terri for joining us today. It's just been absolutely fascinating. But also, I think you've acknowledged the real challenges, but I think you've also affirmed that there's lots of stuff to be positive about and hopeful for in the future. And as somebody who teaches young women and teaches young men as well, young people often always give me great cause for hope in the future. And so therefore, I think that there's lots of positives ahead. So thank you so much again. Please look out for our next event, which we will promote, and we will welcome you back to that in the future. And I think Jane and Terri can, if only we were together, we would be supplying you with wine and nibble, because we have a great reputation for good hospitality at the AJE. So we have to, the next time we have an event in London, which we usually do once a year, we will send you an invite and you can come along, and that will be the perfect excuse for us to spend some money on buying some champagne. So we will definitely do that. So thank you. Everybody's welcome. Everybody can come along and drink champagne. It's absolutely fine. So we will certainly do that so that we can meet you in person. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Nice to meet you, Terri. Take care. Bye. Bye.
See ya.
If anyone would like to stay and chat, they're more than welcome. I don't think I can answer the questions or even have the same level of conversation that we've just had, but I'll certainly do my best.
I love the comment that Deirdre's put in the chat about talking about menopause at work a lot.
Oh, yeah,
I find, Deirdre, I do that all the time. It's awful. I sort of talk about the HRT and now I'm on my medication, or the medication's been changed. It's very funny to watch the looks sometimes. Oh, you're muted. And you're still muted. Oh, there you go.
I enjoyed it in the end because my boss was in an office where the chair for the person that came in was by the radiator, and I would just be burning. So, God, you shouldn't have a chair by a radiator for menopausal women. And he'd go, oh. But it was really, really revealing. I think what Nikki said, this modelling, that really has resonated because, and I also think this thing they talked about women often seeing each other as competition. And I think that's why I had quite a hard time from female bosses, because a lot of them were less qualified than me. And I think there's threat and competition in it as well. And that I found that really sad. But also the best boss I ever had was a man, but he was a family man who clearly loved women and loved his daughters. They were grown up now, but he used to tell me to go home. If he saw me at 4 o'clock at work, he'd say, oh, go home to your children, you know, and that made such a difference. I felt I'd come home, I was working somewhere where, you know, that there was a sense of balance, changed, obviously.